Hi, my name is John Bass, and I'll be highlighting the section inside of Chapter 24 called Colliding Worlds for you today. And I'm also going to be comparing the conquests of both Mexico and Peru. So, the first European settlers in the Western Hemisphere were Spanish. They discovered the Caribbean in the late 15th century. Immediately, they came over and came across the Taino, the prominent natives in the area. The Spanish learned that the Taino had already established themselves inside the land with crops and villages and things like that. Originally, the Spanish sought to build more trading ports on the island, but when they learned of the gold treasures hidden within the soil, they quickly switched priorities in the hunt for gold. However, they didn't have enough numbers of their own to take on such a task as gold mining. They had to develop a system which is called the encomienda system, basically giving the Spanish the right to using the Taino as a physical labor workforce as they looked after the Taino and provided shelter and things like that in exchange for labor. So the Incomerendos, worked very hard and were punished severely when demands for goods weren't achieved. This resulted in rebellions from the Taino, but the Spanish were able to put an end to those rebellions pretty quickly because of their advanced weaponry rather than bows and arrows. So, what led to the Spanish overtaking the Caribbean islands is outnumbering the declining indigenous population. Basically, Taino's population was being wiped out by smallpox and dying skirmishes with the Spanish. So the Spanish soon left the Caribbean in their rear mirrors and set sights for silver in Mexico and Peru. With the Caribbean free of Spanish rule, the English and Dutch took over the islands, working the lands for cash crops and sugar. Hernan Cortez was born around 1485, who set out for the West in early 16th century. As Spain looked to the American mainlands, Cortez went against military orders by setting sail for Mexico with a small army of his own. His success in Mexico can be attributed predominantly to the support from the indigenous in Mexico. They aided Cortez's numbers, contributing trained warriors and also providing shelter for his men. One specific native, Donna Marina, became known as the Trader, as she translated languages for Cortez so they could communicate with the Aztecs. Cortez soon built ships upon the coast and eventually starved the Aztec Empire from goods and food trade. Then he tortured the emperor into revealing locations of golden treasures. So, though Cortez had his advanced weaponry, he couldn't have done it without the help of natives and a smallpox epidemic not completely, wiping out the population immensely. So here's just a little bit more details regarding Donna Marina and Hernan Cortez's relationship. So she warned Cortez of certain planned attacks from the natives that she overheard of, and she warned Cortez so his men could prepare and fend them off and basically survive because he only had a small army, if you remember. She then portrayed her own people overall, but in a way, if you look at it, she paved the way for Spanish rule, overtaking and getting rid of the Aztec Empire. Her involvement led to Cortez's success overall. She changed the game completely. So Donna's language was the main language of the Aztec Empire. It's really hard to say. But she also knew the Mayan language. So basically, a series of translations had to be gone through, as you can see, and then gone backwards just to simply communicate. But without her, things would have gone a lot differently. Some other factors helped Cortez out as well. Overall, it took him 3 years to overtake the Aztec Empire, which he invaded and used the indigenous' aid and hatred for the current empire to basically just help him get to the capital city and take it over. You can see the Aztec Empire in this photo as well. So Cortez essentially left the capital once he arrived because he found out that a Spanish army was coming to arrest him for resisting those orders. He eventually came back after he dealt with that conflict, but then he was forced out in battle against the Aztecs, finally comes back a third time to the capital, and this time he fully seizes control over the Aztec Empire. Throughout this time, he had resistance from the current emperor Cuauhtémoc, but eventually Cortez tortured him and ordered his execution in 1525. Again, just remember that Cortez himself had many other factors aiding his conquest along the way. It wasn't just his military force. So after the conquest was completed, Cortez was named governor over New Spain in 1522 by 1570, the Spanish monarchy had full control over the vast Mexican empire, giving way to the Spanish crown. Now looking at the conquest of Peru, the leader of the expedition was a guy named Francisco Pizarro. He left for Peru with only 180 soldiers in 1530, but 600 men later added to his numbers to help him out. When he first arrived, he already found a dividing dispute taking place between the two brothers who ruled the Incan Empire in Peru, Huáscar and Atahualpa. So he sees this opportunity, further dividing them from each other and turning them on each other, thus collapsing the Incan Empire government. So that was one thing that helped the empire fall, but that was only the beginning. Pizarro had help from the Incan indigenous people as well. They didn't resist the invasion. In fact, they even aided him in taking over. But again, smallpox spread throughout Central America, drastically reducing the Incan indigenous numbers. It took longer to gain full control of, but by 1540, Portugal was considered the lord of the land over Peru. So now comparing Mexico and Peru's conquest in further detail. So Pizarro had less soldiers than Cortez, but he also had more land to cover in order to gain full control of the respective empire. Both of them had indigenous help. However, Pizarro didn't have a specific native literally turning the tide of the conquest. Cortez had Donna Marina, who contributed immensely, as I've already stated. Once these European countries conquered their own new lands, the Spanish used viceroys and audiencias to be the respective government and representative for the Spanish rule. They used different tactics overall in governing, but the Spanish's main tool was the viceroys. So soon after the conquests in New Spain and Peru, the Spanish and Portuguese controlled their new territories from afar. Viceroys were basically the king's representatives from Spain who had power that they could actually enforce. Those people were kept in check by audiencias, which is essentially a review of courts evaluating viceroy performance. So overall, throughout this early modern era, more and more Spanish migrants arrived in New Spain and spread throughout the territory, furthering its borders. So the Treaty of Tordesillas was an agreement between Portugal and Spain, dividing up the Western Hemisphere territories along an imaginary line between the two. Portugal ended up with a large land mass called Brazil. They soon established their imperial forces in Brazil when they discovered sugar plantations along the coast. In total, about 100,000 Portuguese migrated to the new Americas. And then this next slide is just a couple of photos. You can see Francisco Pizarro here, and also you can see in this map photo, you can compare the size of the Aztec and Incan Empire and just how vast the Incan Empire is compared to the Aztecs. And then this last photo specifically describes Cortez's journey to get to the Aztec capital. It took him a while. So, over the 16th century, the Spanish focused on Central and Southern America, while the English, French, and Dutch focused predominantly on founding new colonies in the eastern shore and other territories of North America. They founded colonies like Nova Scotia, Jamestown, and New England, or essentially what is now modern day New York. In early colonial years, life was very difficult for the settlers as they didn't predict that they had to work the land to make profits. They kind of assumed that they would be making livings by trading goods like furs and textiles, but that wasn't the case at all. Without enough money to buy food and not enough food supply in general, colonists began to starve, specifically in Jamestown, when European supply ships didn't bring enough as the colonists had needed and hoped for. From then on, it only became worse from there. New territories were governed by private investors rather than viceroys, or audiencias like the Spanish in Mexico. These private investors paid for the travel and expedition and all other expenses to begin with in the voyage across the Atlantic. So it kind of made sense that the private investors were the governing authorities rather than a English or French dominant crown authority for the time being. They also just didn't use viceroys at all. It wasn't even in their vocabulary or thoughts. Unlike Mexico and Peru, English settlers didn't discover well-established states like the Aztec or Incan empires. Rather, the land was unexplored and they only had few encounters with indigenous peoples here and there. They found out that the indigenous mainly used the land as their hunting grounds rather than building centralized states, which didn't make sense at all to the English. When the English sought to expand territories and boundaries and borders, the indigenous obviously resisted, claiming the new territories were their inherited hunting grounds. Again, the English didn't understand how hunting grounds were so important to these indigenous peoples, but the response wasn't simply annihilating them. They didn't annihilate the indigenous in a war. Rather, they tried to use treaties and agreements when working with them in order to avoid conflict. But conflict with the indigenous escalated on multiple levels down the road. As English colonies grew, the indigenous were being wiped out from basically a 1-2 punch from diseases like smallpox and other diseases from the Columbian Exchange. And also their numbers were reduced whenever they had violent encounters with settlers in the colonies, basically coming from disagreements and a series of raids taking place in both indigenous and colonist villages. Overall, these factors led to the reduction in the indigenous populations. They drastically went down very quickly. So in conclusion, this new world being discovered in the West led to the collapse of two empires and the drastic reduction of the overall indigenous in the Western Hemisphere, but also established growth in population from these new settlers, inherently transforming our Western Hemisphere in so many ways, considering the Columbian Exchange, depopulation, and eventual migration of both slaves and other new peoples to these migrating colonies. Also, the reduction of certain world powers like those two empires and establishing new growth for the Spanish and Portugal empires as well. Basically, just a change in the world power dynamic in general. Thank you for watching.